Okay, meet and greet is over. Let's go. The vehicles traveled into the country and turned onto what a reasonable person couldn't even call a back road. It could hardly even be called a track, which led off a highway and ran off through the middle of a forest. Clearly, the state did not maintain it, though maybe once it had been paved. The track worked its way deep into the forest and up into the hills. It ended at the top of the highest hill in the area, far from the city, but the hazy outlines of the buildings were still visible in the early evening sunlight. At the top of the hill was a clearing, and in it was where the group's camp was set up, and where the rest of their group was waiting for the others. The area offered a wide view of the surrounding region below the hills for several miles, but the forests all around the camp itself did limit the view of anything approaching from close by, from within the hills and forest themselves. The other people in the group were ecstatic to see their fellows returning after being well past their expected return period. Some had wanted to go to the city to try and find their missing people, but Juan had rules in place that prevented them from doing so. Juan's logic was that if a group went missing on a run, then something likely had proved to be a menace to them, and the others would be better off keeping well away. With the group now back together, ecstatic greetings were shared amongst most, and it took them a moment to notice Ross and realize that he was in the place of one of their own who was missing. Juan relayed the news of everything that had happened in the city, how they'd lost one and taken in another, and then took Ross around and introduced him to everyone else. Giving the deputy the tour, Juan pointed out each member in the group and waved to them. That's David, and that's his cousin Dave. Apparently their mothers thought having near identical names would make for a funny joke. Over there, that's Henry, Olivia, and Ava. Andrew is sitting up in that tree keeping sentry. And the man sulking in the entrance of his tent, like he's brooding over something unpleasant, is Ian. The man was the only one who didn't so much as give Ross a handshake. He didn't even look up at the officer, though he certainly knew the newcomer had arrived. Ross stopped, adjusting his hat to better block the glare from the late afternoon sun. Yeah, he doesn't look too happy, does he? He asked. Juan shook his head. Nope. To tell you the truth, officer, I've never even seen him smile. I half expect him to just steal a truck and drive off one night. He keeps himself away from the rest of us for as much of the day as he can, only helps with an issue if it directly affects him. I think he thinks he's above us. Well, why keep him around if he's a detriment? Juan sighed. What he lacks in colorful personality, he makes up for with smarts. He's very intelligent. I think he was a genetic scientist or animal biologist. I know he wrote some papers about predatory animals. With all the new old animals running around, he seems like a good person to have around. He knows a lot about how they tend to act in most situations. He knows a lot about what, makes animals tick and stuff. Spends basically all of his time reading these big scientific biology books he has stacked in his tent. He came into possession of a gigantic set about prehistoric animals, and he has biology and evolution stuff in there too. Just give him his space and we'll all get along. He then took Ross to one of the tents, a blue and green one pitched in a circle with the others. This was, our now deceased member's tent. He's not going to need it anymore, so it's yours. Whatever stuff he left in there, consider it yours too, since all you had on you were guns and some other very basic supplies, one said. I hope you understand, but we can't just let you keep everything you had. All the supplies, the guns, food, medicine, it's going to get distributed to everyone. Ross nodded. Thanks, and that's fine. That was all he could really think to respond with. What more was there to say? One wiped his eyes, and motioned to the tent. Um, there's only one thing I want from in there. He motioned to the door, and Ross nodded and unzipped it, flicking the flap open. Juan pointed the item out, and Ross reached in and took it. It was a homemade knife, and it had a polished, handmade wooden sheath. He handed it to Juan. He took it and chuckled softly. His his name was William. We've known each other a long time. We both made identical knives in shop class in high school. Our teacher was one of those who didn't care what we did. Superintendent flipped out, though. I just won't hang on to this. The rest is yours. Juan sniffed. Now that his people were out of danger, he was finally letting himself react to the death of an old friend. Ross opted to give Juan some space and excused himself, not wanting to just sit in the tent. Walking into the camp, he began to explore around. The tents, it seemed everyone had their own, were set up in a circle around a fire pit, and folding chairs were in the center. Off to the side, and a short distance away from the tents, was a shelter house like the ones commonly found in state parks. Some fur steps were set up around the shelter, with picnic tables and more folding chairs underneath. Clothes were strung up to dry between two trees and one of the nearest tree lines. There was an old trailhead that had a marker indicating it led down the hill and to a cave with a spring and stream, which explained where the group got their water supply from. The group also had a decent-sized pile of chopped firewood stacked next to the shelter house. The group members were either hanging out around the shelter and the fur steps or near the campfire. It was still smoldering and smoking, but had no open flames. Ross wasn't sure where Lori came from, but suddenly, she was standing right in front of him with a smile. "Hey, settling in?" "Yeah, you all have a good spot here. How'd you find it?" "We basically all came from the city, or the surrounding area. Juan seemed to know this place was here and brought us up into the hills to keep out of the way of the chaos that was going on once we all banded together. I'm not sure what it is. It's not a state park or forest or anything, so why there's a shelter and trail here, I don't know. It's not for the cave either. It's just a cave, not a landmark. Either way, it's a good spot." "Is it secure?" Ross asked. Laurie shook her head. "Nowhere is secure right now," she said. "We plan to move on eventually, but we don't know, and we don't have anywhere in mind yet. I think Juan wants us to wait until we get a better idea of what's going on in the rest of the state before we make a move anywhere. A lot of people are doing what we're doing right now, just holding up in the woods and biding time. We've heard a few rumors from people who stopped by then moved on that other survivors are trying to hold up in neighborhoods and old, preserved pioneer-type villages, places you can fortify, but we've not seen any. Cincinnati has been totally deserted. Some folks who passed through here a while back said they'd heard about some communities being built further to the north, and that's where they were trying to head to. Well, I can tell you this. I came down from the north. You're going to want to stay off 127 if you move anywhere in that direction," Ross said, glancing in the direction the road would have been in from his position on the hilltop. He couldn't see the line of it. The horizon faded into a misty haze before he could make the road out. "Traffic jam?" Laurie asked. Ross nodded. "Yeah." Laurie nodded as well. "Those are all over the place. During the winter, people began fleeing the cities to try and find an out-of-the-way place to just wait it all out, and the roads just got blocked. I was in one of those jams on the east side of Cincinnati. Ended up ditching the car and going on foot. Juan and a few others found me on one of their first runs into the city. Took me in. They're a good group of people." Ross smirked a little in response. "Well, first impressions weren't great, but yeah, I can see they are. You're a tight-knit group." "Well, most of us are," Laurie responded, glancing over her shoulder at one of the tents. "The guy in the tent over there? That's Ian. He's an asshole. He was a scientist before this all struck. Ever since the day he showed up, we can all see that he just has this disdain for us. The only reason he's stuck with this group is that he knows you can't go solo for very long right now and have a hope to live. For now, better to stick with whoever you find, you know? One day, though, we'll all wake up and he'll just be gone, or he'll bail if things seem like they're about to go bad. Till then, though, we have to put up with his major superiority complex and his rants about the glory of science and progress and what potential there is for it to advance now that there won't be any laws holding those back who can still work on anything. Just let him have his way and don't bother him, and you won't have any issues with him. Ian hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the entrance of his tent, reading a thick book about something. Ross thought that, if he squinted, he could make out the word theory on the cover. Outside of Ian's tent was an unlit battery-powered lantern. He had it at the ready for once the sun dropped too low to be enough light. Which wasn't far off. The blinding golden ball was now only just above the tree line, its golden rays casting long shadows into the clearing. Eric was stoking the flames and adding fresh pieces of wood to it, getting the fire built back up. Someone over in the shelter house had already turned on one of the lanterns, just like the one Ian had, which were hanging from the ceiling, and others were setting them up on tables beneath the first ups as well. String lights that people would often use when camping had also been strung up on the first ups, and after being plugged into a surge protector, which was being powered by a car battery, they turned on and illuminated each first up with an orange glow. Juan said the same thing about thinking he'll take off one day, Ross replied. Seems to think he makes up for it with his smarts, though. I got the impression he just puts up with him because he knows a lot about a lot of things. Laurie sighed. I will give him that. He knows a lot about the animals that are running around again. And he has been helpful on a few occasions, showing us a good way to dry meat out so it stays good longer. Only when the issue will affect him, though, if it isn't resolved. But helpful. She shook her head. Anyway, with a lot of the roads blocked and a lot of the bridges destroyed, which basically cut the country in half, we are limited on where we can move when we want to. Thankfully, we haven't seen too many dangerous animals out here. We're kind of tucked off the beaten path, and a lot of the animals have been using the roads to move and migrate because it's easier than the woods. So, we're fine for now. Yeah, I didn't see hardly anything modern or prehistoric on the way down here. The only thing I did see was on the road, Ross said. I'd recommend heading east when you decide to move if it was me. My partner on the force, Sheriff James Vincenzo, headed that way when we went our separate ways this morning. He seemed pretty sure east was the way to go if you could, but any direction other than west is good. Yeah, I heard things are worse out in the west. Sounds like they were hit the hardest by all this. Back in the winter, I heard stories online of people eating each other in those camps out in California. I wonder if anywhere in this country kept their shit together long enough to hold it together, Laurie replied. Well, if anywhere in the U.S. did, we certainly haven't found it, and it certainly wasn't out on the West Coast, Ross responded. Laurie nodded. Well, if nothing forces us out of this area, I think Juan wants to stay here at least until midsummer. He hopes by then that things will be a little more stable. We'll then find a place to wait the winter out. Until then, though, this is home, and the city is our department store for stuff we can't find anywhere else or make ourselves. Now, come on. I'll take you over to the others so you can properly meet. No one here is going to try and meet and eat, right? Ross asked with a small smile. Laurie laughed. No raptors here, don't worry. And no cannibals in this camp either. We're not in California. We stayed civilized. My partner and I on the force before all of this, Ross said, gesturing to the air around him. We were trying to catch this serial killer. You all probably saw the name. Waterside Reaper on the news? That was him. We were trying to find evidence to connect our suspect, who we know was the guy. We had no doubt, so we could arrest him. No luck. He covered his tracks too good. Even indirectly would tell us he was the guy when we would talk to him at the station. Not in any terminology we could use as an actual confession, but in a way that we knew what he meant. It had been dark for a few hours at that point, and the group had gathered to sit around the crackling campfire and let their new arrival give a proper introduction to everyone. Ross was the only one present who was any kind of law enforcement or first responder, so there was a great deal of curiosity directed towards him. The group listened while the deputy recounted the story of the tiring and frustrating case that had plagued him and Vincenzo for the last few months, before the apocalypse had begun creeping up on everyone and breathing down their necks like a predator about to strike. All their gazes were on the officer, while he gazed down into the flames and recounted. To no one's surprise, Ian had not joined the group around the fire. After eating, he'd gone back to his tent and sat back down in the entrance, lantern now on, and reading from his book once again. Dinner had been meat from a deer the group had hunted a few days prior, and some canned vegetables mixed into a stew cooked over the fire once it was hot enough. After supper, and after everyone had migrated to the chairs set up around the fire, more wood had been added to build the flames up, and everyone's faces were cast into dancing shadows. The night air was filled only with the crackling of the flames and the chirping and singing of nighttime insects. So, we were on his trail for months. Sometimes, 2 days a week, we'd have a report of a body washing up on the riverbank, always melted with acid and bleach before being dumped into the water to destroy any forensic evidence. If acid and bleach was all that was done to them, then it was a good day. Some of the victims were just... Butcher doesn't even describe it. It doesn't come close. Then the world started falling apart. Bigger issues were dropped onto our already full plates, and we never had a chance to catch him. He vanished from town very quickly after it all started happening, or at the very least he held up somewhere and didn't come back out. I'd say he was one of those people who retreated to the woods to ride it out. He's probably out there somewhere, free to keep doing the same stuff with no fear of being caught anymore. Not that he had that anyway. Ross continued with a sigh, one of resignation over the fact that he could no longer do anything about it anymore. He was a damn psychopath, he added, shaking his head. After a moment, he continued. When things started going bad out west, then everywhere else, Vincenzo, myself, and the others on the force basically did everything we could to keep everyone in our small town calm. We tried to get everyone in town to just keep together and ride it out. And we were. Almost no one opted to leave. And one night in the middle of winter, everything changed. A line of refugees were passing through our town, and while the bridge going over to Indiana, over the river, was gridlocked with cars filled with scared families, the military came in and bombed it. It was completely destroyed, and the center of it just collapsed into the water. I don't want to think about how many people died that night. Things really began falling apart afterwards, and families and officers alike just began packing and leaving in droves. Eventually, as of last week, it was just me and Vincenzo left, and this morning, we both also left. I hope his day wasn't as exciting as mine. A few people chuckled, and Eric, who was sitting across the fire from Ross, spoke up. You know, even when the supply chains were basically non-existent and people were rioting in the street, my manager still made me come to work. Why the hell did you go in? Because the store had already been mostly picked clean by thieves and panic buyers. The looters were starting to target homes instead, so I dressed mine up to look like it had been looted and then went somewhere I knew wouldn't be hit for a few hours until it calmed down again. I tell you, there is nothing like the thrill of restocking shelves when you're expecting looters to rush inside at any moment. Just because your boss thinks everything will be fine, and we need to be ready to sell products to customers again once it calms down. I think he was expecting everything to eventually pass, like a hurricane always does down south, or a tornado does out in the Midwest. He shrugged. Believe me, if I could do it over again, I'd tell him off and stay home. But at the time, part of me didn't think it would get any worse, and I didn't want to give up that last feeling of normalcy I had. And if, on the off chance things did end up smoothing back over again, I would have liked to have still had a job. But it was more wanting to hold on to the few things that still felt normal. I did the same thing in my own way, Ross said. Went to the station every morning, clocked in, did my morning foot patrol, even after people were being mauled by raptors while walking alone outside of their homes. It's hard to let routine go away, especially for such a tumultuous trade-off in return. What was the first sign of what was to come that you saw, Ross? Laurie asked, from her spot next to Eric. Ross looked across the fire towards her. It was last October, about 2 months before things became widespread. Farmer hit a young Therizinosaurus on the back road outside of town. Vincenzo tried to tell me it was just a malformed turkey, until I brought it into the station and shoved it under his nose. We didn't know what it was at the time. How about you? Raptor. It was a raptor, Laurie replied. I saw a picture someone uploaded to social media of one of that their game camera had taken a picture of. It was this big, long-snouted, bird-looking thing with glowing white eyes. It had just snowed, so the owner went out to the spot the next day and shared pictures as they followed its tracks deeper into the woods. When they uploaded one picture of them following the tracks up a hill, someone commented that they thought they saw the raptor in a bush ahead of the uploader. Then there was nothing else. Well, I suppose it goes without saying, especially after what happened in the city, but the large dromaeosaurs are not to be underestimated. One of the very first reports of things starting to go bad in my town involved one. I said people were being mauled by them for a reason. It was only a few weeks after I saw my first dinosaur. This woman called into the station, screaming, shouting, "It's eating my husband! It's eating my husband!" They lived outside of town, and he'd been leaving the house for work when one ambushed him from the woods. By the time we got there and shot the raptor, he didn't have a face anymore. This was around the same time everyone was beginning to accept something was wrong, so we sent the pictures to a paleontologist. He said it was a Utah raptor, but larger than any fossilized specimens. Ross explained. What else happened? From what you said, it sounds like you guys kept things pretty orderly in your town for a while, Laurie asked. Ross nodded. We worked around the clock. Some guys pulled 24-hour shifts, and we were lucky. Our town was mostly untouched by the worst of it. Some hunters noticed a substantial drop in the deer population, though, and one of them said he was chased out of the woods by something big. He said it chased him through the woods the whole way back to his truck. I think it was the same thing that paid us a visit that night. We were spared some of the worst effects, but we weren't unscathed. Ross paused for a moment and then continued. A whole bunch of people called in that night, saying something big was roaming the neighborhood. I kid you not. When a bunch of us officers went out and found it, it was a giant, 6-foot tall quadrupedal crocodile, and it was 30 feet long. Imagine seeing that get illuminated by your high beams at night. It was standing high enough to make eye contact with you through your windshield. Was it a Barinasuchus? Eric asked. Ross nodded. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And we were able to look it up the next day. Oh, I'll never forget that sight, though, of it first appearing illuminated in the car lights. It was raining that night, and its eyes first appeared as just two glowing orbs. Then the body seemed to materialize. As we just stared out of the windshield, it roared and tried to attack us. It suddenly came at us in a gallop. Seeing a crocodile gallop, it's off putting. It's wrong. Worst night of all this before the bombing. Things eventually got to where a day didn't go by that there wasn't a new video or a picture of a sighting put on the internet, but I was more focused on keeping things in my town under control, Ross said. Thankfully, aside from a few incidents, there wasn't much in our immediate area. Like I said, we were spared from a lot of the chaos. It was only after the bridges got bombed that people decided to abandon ship. You know, I saw a lot of those early videos that spread around. I remember this one that went viral of a pterosaur flying over a hiker. Thought it was fake at first. It was so pixelated like all those videos always are, but nope. Eric shook his head and chuckled softly. Other than what happened today, how have you all managed? Ross then asked. We've been doing a lot of running to the city to get supplies we need, Juan spoke up, having only just sat down with the others a few moments prior. Fortunately, that last trip was a bust. We still need supplies from the city, so we have to make a run back soon. What's in the city that comes out at night? Ross asked. You didn't give me a straight answer before. Juan didn't respond right away, but then he sighed and sat up a little straighter and looked across the flames at Ross. Like I told you on the roof, some of the animals are more dangerous than others. There's more out there than just the talking ones. There's something dangerous in that city that comes out at night. It's a mammalian-looking thing with white fur that walks on all fours. I don't know what it is, but it's taller than a person. We spent one night in the city early on and saw it in action. After that, I made a rule that we don't do that anymore. Then we spent last night huddled in the dungeon and didn't make a peep to avoid attracting attention. That was the only time the Achillobators ran off, but we didn't dare try driving out at night. They came back at first light, though, before we even had a chance to make a run for the trucks. Juan paused for a moment and then continued. I don't know what it is. It might be something that was altered by the anomaly. If we compare the anomaly to a virus again, and the animals different strains of it, then the strains all had plenty of rare variants. It didn't just resurrect all the extinct animals in the same form they once lived. Some are exactly like they were before, yes, but others aren't. The talking ones were just the ones that got noticed because they were so unexpected. Look at Velociraptor, for example. They're small, covered in feathers, and kind of cute. But then, the anomaly turned some of them into featherless, talking ones that are as big as the biggest Utah raptors. Then there's some like that which still have feathers while others don't. Hence why I called them variants. They're the same animal, but they're also completely different too. In a way, they're like a variant of the same virus. Those raptors we saw in the city today were, according to what I've read, larger than they ought to have been, and they could talk, which obviously other, more common members of their genus couldn't and can't. So again, the animal is the same, but the anomaly, whatever it was, altered some individuals drastically. Some, apparently, have essentially everything special to us that makes us human. They can be kind, be friendly, and show empathy. I've heard stories of people even befriending some like that. Then there's others that are smarter but don't have that extra layer like the other talking ones. They don't feel compassion or empathy like people. They're just animals with the intelligence of humans but none of the emotion that makes us humans. There's probably others too that we just don't know about. Maybe some which are smart like people but can't talk, for example. Juan's theory was sound, and its implications were unsettling to everyone. Lori ended up speaking up next. That could actually explain why certain animals which needed different atmospheric conditions or oxygen levels are doing just fine in our modern world. Like the big bugs from the Carboniferous. Oxygen levels back then were over 30% higher than today, but the big bugs are just fine now. Those big eagle-sized dragonflies are really annoying too. But something about them has to be different if they're able to survive in our atmosphere, and it applies to other animals too. I've seen videos of people encountering prehistoric fish, which should be in salt water, but they're in freshwater bodies. I didn't really think about it till now, but it's the same idea. So, things are probably even more mixed up than any of us realized, Eric said. Yeah, and you also need to remember that it's not just the dinosaurs that are back, it's every animal that ever went extinct. Even something that died out as recently as a year ago or less now has a new chance. Now, will they all last in this new world? No. It's simply too many animals from too many different times who need too many different ecosystems for everything to coexist forever. But we need to keep in mind there are also animals that went extinct in the last century which are just as lethal as any dinosaur, and it's obvious at this point they were just dropped everywhere and not where they originally lived. As a group, we have to be ready to encounter anything. A Caspian tiger could hunt you as effectively as any other extinct big cat like Smilodon or any carnivorous dinosaur like Utahraptor. You have to be ready to encounter anything from any time at any location, Juan said, pressing the point. Ross hadn't really understood that before, but he remembered that he read that Barinasuchus was from South America and not Ohio. At the time, he didn't really understand the implications, but he was beginning to now. Realizing Juan was right made Ross feel numb inside. And not to mention whatever the hell happened in France. That was one of the very last things I heard about the international situation before the news went down, Laurie said. She looked like she'd pitied the people who lived in Europe. Sounds like something really bad happened over there that we didn't get hit with here. Like what? Ross asked, intrigued. Laurie shook her head. I don't know. I just know that France was holding out better than most governments, second only to New Zealand from what I've heard, and then all of a sudden they collapsed really quickly because of something. The last thing I heard was that they were deploying their own military to try and stop it. Sounded like a whole war was about to break out in the countryside around Paris because of whatever happened over there. I heard it was all about trying to stop something from spreading. Not the anomaly's effects per se, but something else, Eric added. But I was more worried about what was happening in this country to focus on the details of what was going down in Europe. Laurie noticed that Ross looked slightly confused, even with the shadows dancing across his face from the fire, and asked, You're a cop. There's no way you didn't hear about that, Tim. Ross shrugged a little. I guess I was more focused on what was happening at home. My town was falling into chaos by the time the news went down, and all my attention was on trying to keep people calm. Most I heard about overseas were rumors about something weird happening in Europe. Like I said, I didn't focus on something so far away from home when my hands were already full. Hell was already here, and I was trying to protect the people with an ever decreasing police force. Local and national news was all I ever let myself have time to listen to. The international scene was just not on my mind, he admitted. So, what happened in Europe? Ross asked after a moment. Laurie looked around and the others shrugged. I was hoping you knew more, she said. None of us really know. No full picture was ever reported. Guess it doesn't matter now, though, since it's a whole ocean away. A new voice spoke up, for the first time the entire evening. What happened in France was the direct result of brilliant minds and science alike being molested by those who don't understand how complex such matters are. Had they let their scientists do their work without interruption, or fear of time running out, they likely would have had a better outcome, Ian said from his tent, looking up from his book for the first time since supper. Everyone turned their gazes to look at him. "What do you know?" Laurie asked. Ian's gaze was unreadable, and after a moment of locking eyes with her, he simply looked back down at his book and didn't respond further. Laurie scoffed and turned back around to the fire. "Asshole," she muttered. "You know, Ian, you have so much knowledge on these animals that you could help us out with the guesswork rather than just sitting silent and brooding in your tent," she added, speaking with her voice raised to address him without turning around to face him. Ian didn't reply. A short silence fell over the group, with no one speaking and their eyes all staring into the flames. After a few minutes of silence, Eric was the one who spoke up again, sounding like he was speaking his thoughts out loud without realizing it. Virus. When he realized that everyone had turned to look at him, he added, "I was just thinking about one's virus comparison. It reminded me about how the CDC was apparently working on trying to make a virus that would wipe out the prehistoric animals. Never got anywhere with it, though." Laurie snorted, shaking her head in annoyed disbelief. "That was a stupid idea to begin with. There are too many variables and too many completely different, unrelated species appearing around the planet. Plus, how do you make something that only infects what we call prehistoric animals and not modern day ones?" "Short version, you don't," Juan replied. "Where do you even draw that line anyway?" Eric commented. "Where does prehistoric even begin and end? Or what species that were already alive today counted as prehistoric themselves? Some animals around today have been around for millions of years already. Horseshoe crabs have been persistent for the last 400 million years, give or take. Do you count them as modern animals or prehistoric ones?" "Exactly. It was clearly a plan born out of desperation," Laurie replied. "You can't make a virus that infects an Anomalocyrus and a Tyrannosaurus and some extinct deer from 50,000 years ago, but not a raven or a cow or... You get the idea. Too many vastly different animals you want and don't want to infect. Just stupid all around. You can't make one thing that infects completely different animals from across 500 million years. It's..." She looked up from the fire and saw the confusion on Ross's face and laughed in good-natured amusement. "I think the good sheriff over there is lost," she said. The others chuckled as well, not in a mocking way, but more of a good-natured poking fun at way. Ross shook his head. "I don't know anything about biology or prehistoric animals. What's an anomalocyrus?" Ian snapped from his tent, as if it was the most simple word to ever pronounce ever. "There he goes again. I swear I think he thinks we're the most incompetent doomed hicks he ever met," Laurie said with a small snort. Eric nodded and finished his statement. "Yeah. Anyway, Anomalocyrus, it's an arthropod, like a bark scorpion, but it swims. Was about 3 feet long and lived a little over 500 million years ago, give or take, in an ocean where most animals are only a few inches long, so it was an absolute monster. There were a lot of things in the oceans back then, and now, I guess, that look like monsters. Seriously, some of the animals from back then would make anything in modern shark horror movies look like a goldfish," Laurie agreed. "So, what was it that attacked us today?" Ross asked. "You said the name, but I don't remember exactly what it was." "Achillobators," Eric repeated. "One of the biggest dromaeosaurs," one added. "Same family as the velociraptor, but way bigger. Typically, they aren't Utahraptor big, but those ones we ran into sure were. From what we've seen, though, the talking ones usually seem to be bigger. Rarer, but always more dangerous." One chuckled as Ross began to look overwhelmed. "You got some hard reading to do, good officer. If you want to survive in this world, you gotta know what's in it. I'll set you up. I hit pay dirt recently and found this multi-volume set of encyclopedia-type books recently published with all the most up-to-date information on every known prehistoric animal that ever lived. Each volume is dedicated to a specific era, and some are in multiple parts. You can start reading in the morning. Juan stood up. Welcome to the group, good officer. Your new life and a new world starts tomorrow. For now, it's time to hit the hay, he said, not speaking to Ross, but the whole group. Everyone nodded and began to stand up. As the group began to disperse, Ross looked around to everyone before he hurried up behind Ronaldo, wanting to speak with him, but not having had a chance yet. Hey, hold up a second, Ross said, and Ronaldo stopped and turned around to face him. Hey, you from the U.S.? Ross asked. A moment later, Ross realized how it must have sounded from the slightly peeved look on Ronaldo's face, and he quickly clarified, I just meant that if you were from south of the border, I was wondering if you knew anything about what happened down there. I heard on the news the cartels were overrunning the country weeks ago. Ronaldo, seeing Ross meant no offense, sighed and nodded. I was born here, in the city. My old lady immigrated back to Mexico after I moved away from home. She lived in Tijuana, and last time I heard from her, she said the cartels were overrunning everything and seizing power, forcing people to be workers or human shields in their proxy wars for power. The border had already closed, so there was no way she could get back north. We eventually lost contact, and I don't want to think about what happened to her. She told me don't try to come for her, that it was happening all over Mexico and throughout Central America. She said everything was on fire and people were doing more damage than the animals. That was the last thing we talked about. I didn't even get to tell her I love her one final time. Ronaldo stopped and sniffed, wiping his eyes a moment later. Diego is all I have now. He's not blood, but he's family. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, if you ask me, the time for us to be divided by lines in the sand is over. We're all one people now. It's a pleasure to formally meet you, Ross replied. He held out his hand, and Ronaldo took it. They shook hands, and Ronaldo chuckled. You seem like a good one. Happy I didn't whack you with that pipe today. They both chuckled at the comment, and Ronaldo added, You're with us now. Really stuck your neck out to save us when you had no reason to. I've got your back. From now to whenever the next doomsday is. He patted Ross on the shoulder, and they nodded to each other, and turned to go their separate ways for the night. After a moment, Ronaldo stopped and turned around again, adding, And it wasn't just the big 7 cartels fighting across Mexico that everyone was afraid of, he said. Ross looked at him, and the large man continued. According to my old lady, she said that when things were breaking down, that the Cuatro Brazos cartel was moving north out of Central America. Even the most dangerous cartels in Mexico are afraid of them. I think some of them were trying to bring so many others under their flag so they could fight back when they finally arrived. Even in the dim light, Ross's face visibly drained of color. Oh shit, he breathed. The Cuatro Brazos? They'll wipe everyone out they can't use. Hell, their leader, Thomas Rees, makes the serial killer I was trying to catch look like a nice guy. He's been in the top 5 of the FBI's 10 most wanted list for the better part of a decade. Rees had committed some of the worst human rights violations in recent history. What he would do now, in a truly lawless world, made Ross feel sick to his stomach. He was grateful he wasn't anywhere near Rees would be. Not looking like he really knew what to say, Ronaldo simply nodded and turned to walk away again, looking like he was grieving the loss all over again. After a moment and not being able to find any words, Ross started to do the same, but this time he was the one who turned around after a moment. Hey, Ronaldo, he called out. If you ever learn any indication that she's still alive, I'll go with you myself to help bring her out of there safely, Ross said. Ronaldo looked surprised at the offer, but after a moment, he nodded with a grateful expression. Then they parted ways, each heading to their own tents. Ross saw out of the corner of his eyes as someone at the shelter house turned off the lights and lanterns. He couldn't tell who it was due to only seeing their silhouette, but it looked like Henry. Once the lights were out, the campfire was the only light left in the camp, save some lanterns on in a few tents, including Ian's. Ross approached his tent and crouched to unzip the door. As he did, he heard someone call out, "Good officer." He stopped and stood up, seeing Juan standing by his own tent with his arms crossed. Juan was waving him over with the flick of a finger, and Ross approached. Once Ross was a few steps away, Juan sighed and looked him in the eyes. "What you did for us today, that was a good start to earning your place. Hell, you did earn it. Prove it wasn't a fluke guided by self-preservation and you'll be with us for good. But listen, I'm sure you understand that I can't trust any new person completely just yet. Not in this world, not with these people. We've become a family. Until you earn my full trust, know this. If you do anything that hurts them..." He paused and looked side to side for a moment before looking Ross dead in the eyes again. "Modern medicine and the most talented doctors all in a room wouldn't be able to fix what I'd do to you. Look, some people are still figuring things out. That's fine. Not everyone adjusts to such a change right away. You're still thinking like you were before the apocalypse. You're still a cop in your mind. That's fine. Take your time to figure things out, adjust to this world with no rules, and brace for the ugly things you'll have to do. But I'm not thinking like I did before. I've figured out what you have to be ready to do. I'm capable of damn near anything, and I will do anything to keep these people I love safe. I'd die for these people, gladly. I'd also kill someone to keep them safe. Got that? Don't wrong them." As he spoke, there was a dark gleam in his eyes, and it made Ross wonder what Juan had been forced to do to keep the others safe already. He didn't want to know. Ross nodded. "Yeah, I've got it." Juan smiled and nodded, then the friendly look returned to his eyes. "Okay, welcome to the troop then. I really think you are a good one, for the record. I saw your talk with Ronaldo. You hold the good values of a police officer near and dear. I like that, even if you're still a bit stuck with how things used to be. You hold on to those values. Not enough people trying to help each other these days," he said, and extended a hand. Ross shook it. "Thanks. And you don't have to worry about me. As a whole, these are good people. I want to help keep them alive. I'd do what I did today again if I had to. Hell, I'd lead a Tyrannosaurus away on that bike if it meant saving them," Ross promised. "So would I," Juan agreed. "So would I." Ross smiled. For the first time in a long time, he was happy. He was happy knowing that he would not only get to serve and protect people again, the thing he loved most about being a cop in the old world, but that he now had a whole group of people he could continue to do so with. With that, he climbed into his tent. As Ross fell asleep, he heard the sounds of two kauai-oos singing in the nearby trees. Two birds whose song could finally be sung again. Ross had once listened to the recording of the last male, and it had made him feel sad, but now he could hear the duet finally being sung by a pair. Even if they didn't last, even if the species lived again for only a short time, they'd been given a chance like everything else. Finally, their song could be whole again, instead of being sung by only one who never heard the other complete the duet. The anomaly might have destroyed so much, but not all of its effects on the Earth were ugly ones. There was still some beauty. That was a nice thought. There was a chance for good things to come from the disaster, and he'd make sure the good group of people he'd found were able to enjoy that future when they finally arrived in it. The deputy had found a new purpose, and he could let the old world be put into his past with peace.